Canada, Korea and the War was created by the Canadian War Museum to mark the 70th anniversary of the Korean War armistice. It looks at the war itself, the armistice, and the personal connections between Canada and South Korea. Historian Andrew Birch joins us now with more on this special exhibit, which will be here for a number of months. But this is really about a forgotten war, and it's sometimes referred to as the Forgotten War.
That's right. It was actually first referred to as the Forgotten War as it was still ongoing in 1951, largely because this followed very closely on the heels of the Second World War, and the veterans who served in that war were relatively few in number compared to that war, and they struggled to get recognition following the war for many years. Less so the case now, fortunately. So we really were interested in showcasing some of their stories in the exhibition, as well as looking at the consequences of the war for the world and about the relationship between Canada and South Korea today. So we pulled a few stories out from our collection or from contacts that we've made over the last few years. We have stories from veterans of the Kapyong Battle of 1951, a very important battle that was key to the United Nations. We have Bernard Code here, who's talking about his experience of being up on that very isolated hilltop surrounded by the enemy that very scary night, and photos of him with his granddaughter many years later, marking the anniversaries of the war. And we also have the story of one of the nurses. There's about 60 nurses who served in Korea and in Japan. Jessie Chenevert, who actually is about 103 years old, and as we're talking now, is at the Rideau Pearly Health Center in Ottawa, and who served with the 25th Canadian Field Dressing Station in Korea, looking after people who had injuries during the war and after the war as the armistice took hold. We have some photos of her from our collection, as well as some photos of her later in her career. She retired as a lieutenant colonel.
And then the armistice itself, it's almost as though there hasn't been a lasting peace for this.
That's right. So I mean, the armistice was essentially a compromise solution for a very difficult conflict. It starts in 1950 when North Korea invades South Korea. The two had been divided at the end of the Second World War when Japan surrendered, and essentially the fighting started with the North Korean invasion in June of 1950. The United Nations rushed to the aid of South Korea, and a number of back and forth over the years. China intervenes in the fall of 1950, leading to eventually a stalemate, roughly where the war started at the 38th parallel. And so the armistice agreement was a way in which the war was negotiated to a close. The fighting could stop, but it didn't solve the root cause of the problem, which was that North and South Korea were divided and had very different outlooks about what a unified Korea should look like. And that tension remains to this day. But fortunately, the fighting, which killed millions of people during the war, dispossessed and caused people to be refugees and caused enormous destruction, was able to come to an end, and so that allowed for reconstruction. And so we have some stories here of Eddie Wiedeltuck, who was a Inuk soldier who served during the Korean War, and whose memoir is a fascinating recounting of his experience growing up in the North and serving in Korea, and his artworks of hearing the news of the armistice and the excitement with people in the field had for there. We also have the story of one of the only Canadian war bride to come from Korea. So part of that building...
There was only one?
Only one. There were Canadian soldiers who married women in Japan, but there's only one Canadian who married a Korean who came back to Canada as a war bride, Lee Bae-kwa, and they had a child together and lived in Montreal until for the rest of their lives. But then we look at after the armistice, there's this long period of building of relationships between Canada and Korea, and a lot of that's focused on some of the revisits that veterans have had in the years intervening since the end of the war, such as Claude Petit, who served in 1952 and revisited in this past fall, in November of 2022, and visited the graves of many of the people who fell while he served in Korea, and he was joined there by Asia Lee Campbell, who is a Korean young woman who has Canadian parents, who is a bit of a youth ambassador for the United Nations Military Cemetery there, as well as the many veterans who are, in many cases, our bridge to the experiences of the Korean War, who are sadly no longer with us. So Walter Conrad was a long-time serving volunteer here at the War Museum and told his story to many people walking through. And he passed away recently, and we're very sorry to see him go. But it's going to be our responsibility both in Canada and in South Korea, to keep their memories alive.
Right, to keep that going. Hence
absolutely.
the Canada, Korea, and the War exhibit. It's on now until March at the Canadian War Museum here in Ottawa. And for more information, we'll get a link to you up at our website, chch.com.
Thanks so much.